coming today on this crummy weather day. It will be spring, right? It will be. But I want to thank you for coming and taking the time to come to this event. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, Wiscape, and Mel Domsky is going to be moderating, and ASPRO, the Academic Staff Professional Organization, and the Wisconsin Alumni Association. I'm here, I'm Dorothy Edwards. I'm a professor in kinesiology, which is here in the School of Education, and also in the Department of Medicine, in the School of Medicine and Public Health. I have the great privilege of being the president of Profs. So I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank all of you who support Profs. So for those of you who don't know who we are, what we are, Profs is an organization that was created more than 40 years ago by the Faculty Senate to provide a voice for UW faculty with regard to legislative affairs. So we're your legislative voice. Jack O'Mara, who's over here, is our legislative representative. He's been working with us for a long time and doing a great job at the Capitol and also in Washington, D.C. So we're really grateful for the wonderful people who work for Profs. Michelle Culver, who organizes everything and keeps me straight. So I couldn't do this job without her. We have a great panel assembled today, and I want to thank everybody. I know everyone on the panel is really, really busy. There's a lot going on at the Capitol and the Board of Regents and here in the School of Education. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come talk to us about this important topic of the budget. So our panelists, Jeff Brandt, sitting right here to my left, is Senior Director of State Relations for the UW system. Prior to joining the UW system, he worked for the Wisconsin State Senate and then the district office of former Congressman Dave Obey, and he's a graduate of UW Stevens Point. Nick Hillman, Professor Nick Hillman is a professor of educational leadership and policy analysis, a member of the Prof Steering Committee. He studies higher education finance and policy, and he's testifying in Congress tomorrow. So this is his warm-up. Give him some hard questions. Next to him is State Representative Dave Murphy, who has served in the Wisconsin Assembly since 2013, quite a friend of higher education, I will say. Currently chairs the Assembly Colleges and Universities Committee. He's a full-time legislator, and he attended UW Fox Valley. And at the end of the row is State Representative Katrina Shanklin. She's also served in the legislature and the Assembly since 2013, serves on the Colleges and Assembly and Universities Committee, and she attended Marquette University in UW Marathon County, and she's a graduate of UW-Madison. And she also served as a member of the Joint Finance Committee during the 2017-19 budget process. So you can see we've assembled a panel with a great deal of expertise and authority around the budget, particularly the budget affecting higher education, which is really important to us. And the last person I'm going to introduce is our moderator, Noel Radomski. He's the Managing Director of Wiscape, the Wisconsin Center for the Advancement of Post-Secondary Education. Noel keeps all of us on this campus informed. He lets us know what's going on in higher education and is a great advocate for all of us. And I'm glad he agreed to serve and to help us with this event. I turn it over to you, Noel.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy. On your tables, there are these things with a pens. These things you can write questions on for the panelists. And I'm going to... Oh, I apologize. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Oh, so Michelle and Jack, thank you very much. Carrie? Is Carrie here?
Right here.
Carrie played a critical role in this program, as all programs in Wiscape. Thank you. Is Vanessa here? Vanessa. It also plays a critical role. She is the World Extraordinaire graduate student. And unfortunately, the faculty director for Wiscape, Professor Cliff Conrad, had other commitments. So he couldn't be here. So he asked me to be his substitute. Real quick before, I'm going to toss two questions that I decided not to give them the questions in advance. So we'll see how they handle this. We'll see if they can interpret my questions. Instead of handwriting, I typed them out. So there are two questions, if you think about it. If you don't want to answer them, that's fine, but then we'll use that against you. So before we get started, the title of this forum, co-presented by a group of us, the 2019-21 Biennial Budget, colon, because we're an academic enterprise, we need at least one colon or semicolon, implications for higher ed. So when I thought about that, it's like, okay, what does that mean? Well, what is the definition of higher education in Wisconsin? Well, obviously, for those of us around here, the vast majority of us in the room, UW system, especially UW-Madison, right? Right. What else? Wisconsin Technical College system. The main campuses and the regional campuses, right? Some of us might have graduated from them. What else? We have the Wisconsin Independent Colleges and Universities, such as Edgewood College, Lake College, Lawrence, Ripon, etc., St. Mary's, Alverno. And then finally, we also have the for-profit colleges and universities. We won't talk about them. But they're decreasing substantially, and Nick and others have done great research on that. Well, what are the higher education pieces in the biennial budget that are out there? And I decided, I just created A through G. I don't have numbers. One obviously is the capital budget. We've read about that quite a bit in the newspaper recently, what happened at the subcommittee level and what happened at the State Building Commission level. State financial aid, the Higher Education Aids Board. We also have, and Nick again, not to emphasize Nick, but the state has now advanced performance-based funding, a small percentage of the budget, GPR, going to UW's system, previously started at the technical college system. The pay plan, yay, for those of us who get funded by the state and or public other forms of money, that will be later on. Tuition, we have legal authority versus political authority. So will there be a tuition freeze, yes or no? Will there be tuition differentiation, yes or no, within a campus? We also have, now, we have the Wisconsin idea as expressed by the UW Extension that the majority of those units are now at UW-Madison. So you've got a piece of that. And then, of course, there's very specific funding for research, some research enterprises, Wisconsin Lab of Hygiene, etc. Implications. So I thought about this, but I'm trying to wrap up. Implications. What are the implications for higher ed budget in the 1921 budget? Well, it's going to be, what type of student are we going to recruit in the future? Who are we going to admit? Who are we going to enroll? Who's going to be retained and graduated? We also have state prioritization of and funding of academic programs. Should there be more state funding specific to STEM programs as opposed to arts and humanities? UW system has recently revised policies on high enrollment versus low enrollment programs, which gets replicated and driven perhaps by the legislature. What about faculty recruitment and retention as it relates to pay plan? What about new buildings and renovation of existing buildings? What type of family and student support do we want to offer tomorrow's students to diversify? Students on Madison campus, Madison Area Technical College, Madison College, etc. What's going on with and how will it continue the rhetoric of education versus training, the false dualism of those two entities? Liberal arts versus professional degree programs. We heard another story this morning on Wisconsin Public Radio about UW Stevens Point. What about addressing the rural-urban divide in Wisconsin? How are we going to address that? Teacher education, curriculum, pre-college programs. How will it contribute or reduce to Wisconsin's income inequality? How will it reduce or grow academic achievement gaps? For example, high school students from low-resource school districts to high school graduates from high-resource school districts. Winners and losers. What are the priorities in the current, the proposed gubernatorial budget? K-12 funding, special education, categorical aids, question of gas tax, etc. What are the priorities for higher education? Who votes? Don't forget to vote if you haven't done so already today. Who votes? It tends to be older, not students, older individuals. And we also have, with the demographics, we have a greater state share of contribution to Medicare and Medicaid. So what impact will that have on the vote for UW system, the tech college system, the state financial aid system? If you follow the Marquette Law School poll, you'll see that higher education ranks at the very bottom, the most recent poll, as opposed to other states where higher education is a priority. What impact will that have on the votes? And then, as always, tuition can serve as a substitute for state funding. So my two questions based on what that is, and I'll stop now. And let's see, here I've got a stopwatch. So we have to be out of here by 1:50. No, we don't have to be out of here. Several people have appointments at 1:30, so we'll have to stop at 1:15. But for those people who stay here, you can tackle them after 1:15. But please let people who have 1:30 appointments leave at 1:15. So I'll start with the first question, and I'm going to not go in any priority order, so you have to stand up, but you have to say something. Okay? And you can't ignore the question. So first of all, how can UW system, because we're looking at system here, become a priority? That being receive funding by the legislature and governor through the gubernatorial vetoes and potential overrides, given the other public priorities I discussed, as well as the priorities by Governor Evers and the Republican legislature. So how can UW system become a priority and retain that sense of priority, meaning funding, from now until June 30th or July 1st at midnight? It'll be done by July 1, right?
Absolutely.
There you go. We heard it here first. We made news.
Uh-oh, there's a camera here.
No! I didn't say a year, though. That's what. There we go. All right, so I'm going to stop here and just please open it up, and anyone go at it, and I'll press start even though it has no meaning. Okay, go ahead. Representative
I
Murphy?
don't know if I need a microphone. Can people hear all right? Okay. So, Noel talked about what is a priority in a particular state, and in some places maybe the university is showing up as being a higher priority than it is here in Wisconsin. I never understand exactly how those questions come to these people and what their thinking is at the time. You know, if I have a son or daughter that's dealing with a heroin addiction, university's going to drop way below that. If I'm out of a job, the university's going to drop below jobs. If and so there are so many things that touch these people's lives on a daily basis, and trying to get ahead of some of those things can be very, very difficult. And I don't think that means that it's not a priority to people. It just means that in their personal life at any particular time they're dealing with other very, very important issues. So it also was mentioned here, talked about the priority. Is there a fight between the tech college system and the university for money? You know, maybe a little bit, but I've never looked at it that way, and I've never seen it that way. We look, as the chair of the Colleges and Universities Committee, when I'm looking at these things, I look at what we're trying to do and whether we have the funding to accomplish what we're trying to do. And so I never look at pitting one against the other.
Thank you. And that was the second question I posed. I like that, Representative Murphy. You're ahead of the curve. The second question, and obviously you can combine them or ignore one or the other, is UW system, the Wisconsin Technical College system, in a race for scarce state funding. As many of you know, historically, the technical colleges receive a large majority of their financing from local property taxes, but that's slowly changing. So that's the context. Others? There's three of you.
Okay, well, hello everybody. I'm Katrina Shinkland. I represent Orange County in the Wisconsin State Assembly, so from the Stevens Point area. I think the answer to how the UW system can be a priority is if public support moves upward and we elect people who also recognize the value, the intrinsic and inherent value in the UW system, and in higher education, especially access and affordability to the public. I think we're in the Wisconsin Idea Room right now, is that right? Okay, well, we're in the Wisconsin Idea Room, so I feel like it's very important for me to mention that UW system isn't just about encouraging people to explore ideas, to challenge their critical thinking and enhance their skills, but it's also about serving the entire public. It's about serving the whole state. And I do think that we need to do a better job talking about every single thing that happens here and at all the other campuses in the state. One example, I read the CALS magazine, which just got sent to my home last month, and I read the whole thing cover to cover on a Sunday afternoon, and I was like, I'm reading this on purpose because I want to talk when I have farmers and county board supervisors and health departments and dairy business folks in my office every week. I want to talk about what's going on. I want to talk about it. I'm being intentional. I want to talk about the research that's happening at UW-Madison so that when they go home they think, oh wow, there's value in funding higher education in Wisconsin. It affects me personally, right? So I think we have to do a better job talking about what's already happening, and then we also need elected officials who recognize the economic value, the value to society, and the value to the individual when you do fund higher education in Wisconsin. So I think Governor Evers put us on a nice track. In his first budget that was introduced on February 28th, he included a $150 million investment above the base. Given that over the past 8 years, we have had the lowest level of state support from the state to the University of Wisconsin system, I think that is a positive gain for all of us. But in addition, what I think is actually even more important is he recognized what happens when you don't fund the tuition freeze. And so he decided to keep the tuition freeze in place but actually pay for it, setting a really important precedent for future elected officials to understand that when you're relying primarily on tuition, that tuition freeze can be harmful to the overall access to education for students and to the people on campus when you do that. In addition, I think he put a lot more money into our faculty and staff. That 2% pay plan increase in both years is really valuable. And he also put more money in, specifically 20 FTEs and agricultural agents as part of extension. And I think that recognizes the value of UW's system. I think we're getting back to where it used to be, but I also believe we all have a duty and responsibility to talk about the good things that are happening on campus every day and how they impact and positively affect the community. We all know that for every $1 you put into the UW system in Wisconsin, you get $23 back. In my 6 years as a legislator, I've never found a better investment. I've never found a better return on investment than $1.23. $1, $23 back to the economy and the local community. So as someone who represents UW Stevens Point, which has had tremendous challenges, especially over the last year, but also over the last few years, I recognize the need every day to talk about these issues and to bring people together off, from campus to off campus and vice versa, so that we are exercising the Wisconsin idea, but we're also building connections. For too long, I've seen people who do want to pit the technical colleges against the university system, and even at my office hours the other day, someone said, well, we should be giving all the money to technical colleges because universities don't need it. And I said, hang on, let's talk about this. We spent 30 minutes on the value of higher education in Wisconsin, and I had the president of SGA sitting right next to me talking about what she did every day, and people were asking questions about what was happening on campus, and I talked about the paper science program, and I talked about the English major, and which employers were looking for English majors in the community. And suddenly, people were thinking, okay, there is value assigned to this, and it isn't cut and dry, one is good and one is bad, or one needs more money and one doesn't need anything. But until we get a handle on affordability on campuses, which I think leads to resentment when people say comments like, well, I can't afford it, therefore no one should be able to go, or we shouldn't be subsidizing it. Until we get a handle on affordability, I think those conversations are going to be challenging. And I'm not saying that it isn't relatively affordable compared to other institutions across the nation, but to an average citizen in Wisconsin, higher education can feel out of reach to them, and we've got to do everything we can as policymakers to put it in reach for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, with a follow-up that I think will connect some of the dots that I'm hearing between, this was really helpful and I think constructive exchange. Is we have immediate needs, the heroin, somebody who's facing a heroin overdose or whatever health needs that they have. And you have long-term needs about the state's future, and I think that the value proposition for universities is that we are training the medical professionals who can meet that person and that family's immediate health needs, but at the same time training people so that we can be proactive and preventative, so that we can maybe solve some of these really tough problems that people are dealing with today. So it's both immediate and long-term. That's what I'm hearing with this exchange, which is exciting and hopeful, but I think really hard to articulate sometimes. That's one of the biggest value propositions of our university system, is that these are our neighbors who are going to help us in problem solve, and that's the kind of neighbor I want to have. But the social returns to education are vast, and there's been a lot of question in academic research on what is the return to education, the individual returns to education. Maybe is this just a sheepskin effect, people who are going to do well in the labor market, just now have a credential and they were going to earn a lot of money anyways, or is there value added from a credential? And there truly is. Even the most skeptical researchers are now agreeing, like, yeah, there is truly value here. On the rounds, about 7 to 9% for every additional year of schooling on average. And so that's just your personal benefit, and the social benefits are even larger. So I think connecting those dots is really important, but it's, think about it in terms of our neighbors and our problem solvers who can meet the immediate needs and also prevent them in the future.
I would just add that I think this question actually defines my job, so I'm supposed to be the person who should answer this question. But I have a great one, we'll try it out. I think that you opened up while talking about some of the public perception and polling out there. And it's a person in my role and in many roles in the room, it's a little daunting that public perception does not recognize the value of higher education overall. And there are certain sectors where it's very unpopular, very skeptical. So when you talk about convincing the legislature and the governor to share these priorities, I think you have to go to the public in general. And that I think reflects a lot of what you've heard up here. The legislature and the governor tend to reflect the view of the public that elected them. And that's sometimes hard for us because we don't sometimes like what the legislature does or we don't like what the governor does. But they tend to reflect those values. So if you want to win this argument and this discussion, I want to call it an argument, and you want to reinforce the value of higher education, you have to go beyond the Capitol. And I think go out and talk to people and reinforce it there. And neighbor to neighbor, like we talked about, but also campuses have to do a really good job of talking about their value and talking about themselves. I'm not always good at that as people in general and as an industry in general, going out and saying, look at the great work I'm doing. So I would say that you want to go a step beyond the governor and the legislature and actually go out and talk to the public in general about the great work that's happening on our campuses and the impact it has on the economy and society in general.
Great. No, that was 10 minutes and 30 seconds for 2 questions. Really good. Representative Murphy?
Well, I was going to say that, the Wisconsin idea came up, and of course, I mean, the Wisconsin idea goes way back into our state history, and it's the idea of getting the knowledge and having the university help people at the 4 corners of the state, and that's fine, but then I question sometimes whether we're really doing that very well. So in the current state budget, the governor calls to spend more money to put an ag agent in every county in Wisconsin. I don't think that's a good idea, and I don't think that's how we're going to maximize the Wisconsin idea, and it's not how, if we want more funding for a university, we have to be able to reach out to those people in Wisconsin in those different areas and say, this is how we can help you, this is what we're doing. So, do you want an ag agent in your county, or do you want a drug counselor in your county because you have an opioid epidemic? And I think that's a question. If you start going out to the public and asking them that question, they're going to have a heck of a different answer than what the governor's giving us right now. And so we have to be able to figure out how to spend our money wisely. And we have to be able to do the kinds of things that are touching the people's lives out there in the rest of the state.
Okay, thank you very much. If you have questions, if you haven't done so already, well, you haven't because there's only one here. So if you have, please write any questions down, and then Michelle will pick them up. So if you want to raise your hand once you have a question, and please do better penmanship than I have. How will the divided government affect the budget process? Question mark. Can common ground in support of higher education be found? So again, how will the divided government affect the budget process? Can common ground in support of higher education be found? Which suggests it's not found right yet.
Last time, so I'll go first this time. I think, first of all, how will it affect the split government affect the budget process? I suspect it will make it longer overall. I suspect it will make it a little more tense on all issues, let alone higher education. I think we've seen that already. But I also remember when the last time I was working in the legislature, we had united government, and we passed a budget about 4 months later. So that kind of isn't out of the ordinary anymore for budgets to happen later, for budgets to get the rancor to get a little heated. So I don't think the divided government, I think it'll have a huge impact, but not as much as I think some people think. I think there's going to be a lot of anxiety and discussion early on, and that probably will fade back a little bit as we get closer to actually getting something together later in the year. But in terms of higher education, one of the things that we found is that both sides have spoken about the time to invest in the university. We've gotten a very positive overall reception to what the UW system put forward as a budget request, $107 million over the 2 years, plus additional funding to fully fund the freeze and the compensation plan. So we feel there's a lot of support for the idea of investing. What that looks like in the end, that's obviously where the rubber meets the road, but we feel that right now there's bipartisan support to do something for the university. How much that is the key, but I guess I'm not as pessimistic as others about the impact it will have on us because of the conversations we've had with leaders like Representative Shanklin and Representative Murphy and their colleagues. So.
Others? And if you don't want to say anything, you can say pass.
Okay. Well, I think let's just look at what happened with regard to the building commission. So it appeared that the vote, which ended up being partisan in the full building commission a couple of weeks ago for all the UW building projects as well as all state building projects, 2 votes in total, were voted on a party line basis 4-4. And as a result, no building projects were recommended to the legislature's Joint Finance Committee. That's a powerful statement. It's a terrible statement. That is a terrible precedent to set, where we're holding state building projects, and by we I don't mean me, but where some members of the legislature are holding state building projects hostage for political points. I'm very worried about the institution. We've seen the erosion of institutions in our country in government over time, and we're starting to see it in the Capitol as well. When you take something that is supposed to be a significant commission like the Building Commission and see it become a place where one party chooses not to enumerate a single, or to recommend the enumeration of a single project, that isn't just disappointing. I think it could set a precedent for future budgets, which concerns me. Another precedent that I'm concerned about is typically the legislature works off the governor's budget. Part of the governor's role is to introduce his 2-year biennial executive budget for her. But what happened this time is the governor introduced his budget, and within days, the majority leader and speaker said, we're going to start off of our own base budget, or we'll write our own budget, our own alternative budget. And every single member of the legislature I have asked, who's a Republican, I've said, hey, are we working from base, or are you guys going to introduce your own? And I've noticed they won't actually answer my question. And I do think that's troubling because we have legislative advocacy groups in the Capitol. For example, the Counties Association is working today advocating for kids and their welfare and their health. And they don't know the process in terms of, are there 2 budgets, or are we just working off base and introducing amendments? But from a clarity standpoint, from a time management standpoint, from an institution standpoint of protecting the institution, I don't think it's a good thing that some in the Capitol aren't willing to respect the process and how it's typically been done. I don't think that an election change or a change of power should change the way that we operate in the Capitol. I think it's important that we stick to those precedents. They're there for a reason. It's so the public can understand how to play into the process and make their voices heard. So I would say so far divided government has been a challenge, but only up to the point where people are willing to make it a challenge. It's really incumbent on all of us as elected officials to not only do our jobs, but to do our best to work across the aisle when we can. And I think what I'd like to see happen is, at least with the UW budget, if everyone could agree that it's time to reinvest back in the university after 8 years of, as I said, the lowest level of state support in our state's history that's concerning for the UW, could we get to where that $150 million is in terms of funding the tuition freeze, funding the pay plan increase, and making sure we're reinvesting? I hope so. I think $150 million is modest. We're not asking for the moon or the stars, and I would hope that that's where we can get. It's going to be very important that we have these conversations, not just in the Capitol, but across the state. And I'll point out the governor is planning and traveling across the state this week and the coming weeks to hear directly from people, and he's starting at UW Stevens Point tomorrow. So I know the number one thing you will hear tomorrow is we have to fund the university system because it affects our community in Stevens Point tremendously. And it's people's jobs on the line, but it's also the local mom and shop down the road. It's our small businesses. It's the integrity of our community and why many of us chose to live there in the first place. So I do hope we can have that conversation in the Capitol to find common ground.
Thank you. Anyone else on that question? Representative Murphy?
So, divided government, it causes some challenges. There are times when we have to come together and come to compromise on some things. But whether we work off in the governor's budget or not, I consider it to be a fake issue. We didn't work off in Scott Walker's budget last time either. So, you know, that's not really that big of an issue. You're always looking at the governor's budget for what he looks at as being important. So even though you may be crafting your own budget, you're always going back and you're looking at the governor's budget and saying, well, he's asked for this and we're going to do this, so how far apart are we? Is this something that, you know, if we do this or that, is that something that we can compromise on? When you look at the governor's budget, the governor did not put in what the university asked for. He put in some other things. So I think there's a really good chance that the university could get maybe all or pretty close to all of what it requested, even though it may not get what the governor has in there. You know, I talked about the county extension, and again, it's about what people want rather than trying to say, you know, because they've talked about, well, we went all around the state and we talked to people. Well, I got to tell you, I've been around the state a fair amount, and I've been around my district a lot, and when I talk to people, they're not telling me that they need more ag agents, they're telling me that their problems are something different. And I think the more that we can address what their needs really are, the easier that this is going to be for us. Just one item in this budget. We talked about the building, the capital budget. I think at the end of the day, Republicans looked at this as, this is a capital budget that's far too large. And because there's a lot of decisions that are going to have to be made about what are we going to prioritize. We want to go back and look at it sort of as a complete block. So we're not throwing anything out and prioritizing ahead of time over anything else. And everybody's going to get a fair shot that we're going to look at it. I'm kind of tough on building projects. I will admit that. And one of the reasons why is because we're not growing student numbers in the state. So I'm very concerned about anything that builds our university footprint very much. Because one of the issues that we have is maintenance. And every time you increase the footprint, the maintenance cost goes up. So you want to keep that under control as much as possible and not overbuilding for what you're going to have for a student population. On the flip side, we talk about pay, and we thought, well, we'll give a 2% pay increase. Well, the 2% across the board might be great, but pay is something that is a free market, and we have to compete in the marketplace at reasonable salary levels. And with you know, 2.8, 2.9, 2% unemployment, whatever, there are lots of jobs available, and people have lots of choices. And I see this all through state government. It's not just with the university. It's at many levels of government where pay raises, we're not going to have any choice. We have to give more pay raises. I mean, as an example, it was shocking to me, we talked about our problems of staffing corrections. I didn't realize that if corrections officers would have made $16.35 an hour. I gotta tell you, I wouldn't do that job for $16.35 an hour. And we can't seriously say that we're doing a good job of making sure those places are staffed if that's all we're going to pay those people. And I think here at the university it's the same thing. It's a marketplace, and we have to be able to fit into that marketplace.
Nick?
I thought at first I didn't have anything to add, so I don't want to just eat up time for this, but there's something to add here that I hear through this conversation. And I'm teaching a course on higher finance now, so this is just brought on my mind. There are 3 ways that we talk about finance in higher ed, and we blurry all 3 of those. And so maybe one thing that would help us all as we leave today is to think about 3 different buckets of finance. We have the cost bucket, and what I mean by that is how much does it take to deliver education, to deliver the quality of education that we need in our state. What is the expenditure side of the house? And that's the pipes and wires, that's your human resources, your benefits, all that stuff. What's it take to spend? The other one is subsidy. Who's going to cover the cost? And so that's going to be state, federal, or philanthropic sources typically. And then the third, and I would argue most important still in many cases, is the pay side, the price side. So what do students end up paying out of pocket for all of this? So when one of those things changes, all 3 have to be in harmony in one way or the other. So if the costs of delivering education continue to rise 1% over inflation, as they do and will continue to do, we're not bending that cost curve. And that's a whole different issue, not just for education, but healthcare and a number of other social services that require professionals to deliver. But it really comes down to that balance between subsidy and price, and where our priorities, what should that balance be?
Right, thank you. So that's 12 minutes, which is good. So several of you gave me questions. I don't like that one. That's blank. I don't like that one. That was the last one that was used. But so please, if you have other questions. This question maybe touches upon what Representative Murphy was talking about, or maybe I misinterpreted him. But this is for everybody. There is some research that the UW system no longer works. I think, that's just a hypothesis for our smaller state population. And then there's a reference to online education. There's a reference to demographic shifts of the number percentage of high school graduates between now and 2026. There's also, we're competing with ourselves. Some institutions offer the same degrees, etc. So the question apparently is, how do you see this dilemma playing out in the next 5 to 8 years? You can put that in the context of this biennial budget. Are there winners and losers? We touched upon winners and losers before, but perhaps we could, I'll synthesize this and talk about, Nick, keep focusing on Nick. Nick did research on education deserts, meaning access to higher education, both geography as well as other forms. So the question does become, Wisconsin population as it relates to the 18 to less than 65-year-old population is decreasing somewhat. And our institutions were created during a period of growth. So what does that mean for the UW system? We recently had restructuring, so we have the former UW colleges are now affixed to 7 comprehensive and doctorals in UW Milwaukee. And there's significant enrollment challenges, especially to the UW colleges, but also, Katrina and I, we spoke at Stevens Point twice, but also to the comprehensives. So that's a really big question, and it goes beyond, but it's also infused within the biennial budget. It's a big issue. People say, well, look at the technical colleges, look at this, look at that. And if, in fact, enrollment's going down, or maybe focusing on adult learners, maybe focusing on recruiting, admitting, enrolling, and graduating the significant growing population of Latinx students in Wisconsin, whereas the white kids are dropping. So the question becomes, as the demographics change, and as our institutions of higher ed were established during a period of growth, how do we deal with that today, and how does that impact people voting for GPR and voting for looking at the tuition levels What do you think?
All right, so I've thought about this a lot, given that, and I'm sure you've all seen the news about UW Stevens Point over the last year. Again, has anyone not read one article or heard of UW Stevens Point in the news over the last year? Okay.
I'll just joke.
Oh, okay. So we're one of the institutions that has seen these challenges up front, and UW Superior is another one, and UW Oshkosh is the third one, and they all have different challenges, but born from the same causes, one of which is high school demographics. Another is institutions are becoming more nimble at graduating students on time, and as they do so, they lose that extra semester or year or 2 years of tuition dollars. UW Stevens Point did a great job of changing the amount of credits they went through to try to find, is this superfluous or is this not necessary, to try to keep the cost of education down and affordable for students. They're one of the most affordable institutions. Well, they paid for it and lost tuition dollars and lost students on campus, right? So that's another piece of the pie that changes issues. I think also if you look at who Stevens Point serves in Wausau, Marshfield, and Stevens Point, they tend to be more non-traditional students. They tend to have jobs, kids, other issues at home to manage, and they might drop out and come back and drop out and come back, or need additional support. And I think that population needs more attention and resources as it relates to it. I also think competition across institutions, as tuition becomes and has been for decades a greater share of your revenue and what you rely on to keep the doors open, the lights on, and the faculty paid, that competition is negative. Some people would say that's great, let the best institutions win, it's a free market. What I would argue is, this is not a business. It should be run like a business, and that you should always be in the black, right? You should manage it well, but higher education serves a greater need than just a capitalistic function of you go to school, you get a degree, you go to work, and that's it. We live in an economy where people change jobs 11 or more times throughout their profession. So when you go to college, whether technical or high, 4-year or post-bac, whatever it is, you aren't just training for that one job, hopefully, but you're also getting the skills you need and the credential you might need down the road for something. But you're thinking about, and you're getting that critical thinking training so you can be nimble and flexible and adaptive and move from profession to profession. As long as we have competition across campuses where we're not managing the UW system as a whole, we're going to see winners and losers. UW Superior and Stevens Point and Oshkosh, which I think has an almost $20 million or $13 million deficit by 2020, are going to be the losers. And the 2-year colleges that were just added into the 4 years were also the losers, and I think that's why they restructured to try to save them. But until we look at the total enrollment in the state and manage it as a system and find ways to keep the doors open in areas of the state that would otherwise be completely and inordinately underserved, I don't think we're going to see 26 campuses 10 years from now. And that's actually what worries me greatly, because if you look at the map of by county percentage of college degrees, it is exactly in line with where the college campuses are. Anyone can see that. The penetration of the people who have a degree past high school is much higher in areas where there's a physical campus. So yes, online learning is important, and campuses need to do a better job of adapting to that. So do they need to have weekend courses and night courses. But it isn't just online. We have to get people into the doors because they need mental health support, they need childcare support, they need, if they're returning veterans, support that way. UWSP was leading the state on this returning veterans seminar that had tremendous impact on our ability to retain students. I think retention is just as important of a piece as recruitment. I think people forget about retention and the role that higher education institutions should be playing in keeping students on campus and keeping them successful. And I'll point out that private elite institutions do an incredible job at it for all the wrong reasons, but so they can brag that no one drops out. But we should have just as good of retention rates as them. We should spend more time and money on resources on each individual that chooses to go to college first And then we should look at Dr. Radomski's research. Who aren't we serving? How do we get them in the doors? How do we get them to stay? And oftentimes it's whether it's having programs in place for people who are multilingual or for people who might need childcare resources. I know at UWSP our wait lists for childcare and mental health are tremendous, and I'm sure it is statewide. So we have to look better look in a better way and think more holistically about this issue. And I would prefer that we try to mitigate the competition between campuses. One of my suggestions is we should really have a Blue Ribbon Commission on higher education in the state, and it should include the technical colleges, the universities, workforce development and economic development experts. We have a great economy right now. We had 3% growth last year. We're looking at 2.1% growth this year. But we can't rely on that growth forever, and eventually the trends are going to switch, and we will go to a recession, and then we will have people come back. So if we start shutting down campuses right now and saying, well, too bad, we had a good run, Wisconsin no longer needs to be great at higher education, we're going to pay for it later. I'd prefer that we get ahead of the trend now and plan this together and figure out ways we can work together instead of against each other.
And just a side note, the last time Wisconsin had a Blue Ribbon Commission on higher education was in 1969 with the Kellett Commission. So several of us have been talking about this throughout the state. And as opposed to putting it in the political environment, several people, business leaders in particular, have said, make it a citizens commission, appointed by government, of course. So perhaps a little, not quite as partisan. I'm sorry about others.
I would just say that I agree with Representative Shanklin that in the future, the ability to keep every one of these campuses going may be difficult. It's going to depend upon what the demographics are and numbers. We have students out there, and they're customers of our universities, and if we can't, if they're not going to go there, there's not a whole lot we can probably do about that. So we have to figure that out. Will we need more capacity in the future? Well, I doubt whether we're going to need more capacity than we had 10 years ago. We may get back to that level, but going over that would be unlikely. I think online learning will continue to grow. Representative Shanklin talked about the map that showed the number of degrees in counties that are around universities, and that there's no question that definitely shows that there are more college degrees in those areas. The problem with that is, though, is that's always a snapshot looking backwards. So, I think we need to be looking forward and saying, well, just because that's the way it's been in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it will be in the future. And I think this is a phenomenon that's going to continue to grow, and we need to figure out exactly how we're going to fit ourselves into that new paradigm.
Thank you.
I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I think that if you take a look at the UW Systems budget request, it reflects the challenges we're talking about, both enrollment-wise and demographically. Our capital budget focuses on replacing, renovating, remodeling, rebuilding existing facilities. We're not trying to add a lot of square footage. That's what the President Cross is very, very serious about. But we understand that. We're not building a ton of new residence halls because we understand that that need may not be there. So we're renovating existing facilities and maintaining them, like we spoke of earlier. Our operational budget does the same. We focus on high-demand programs. We focus on student services that we know are successful. One of the things that Representative Shanklin mentioned was retention. We're focusing on the kind of advising that we know works. Places like Georgia State, where they were able to wipe out their entire difference in their achievement gap because they had this intensive advising program where students, first-time students in particular, first-generation students, are kind of have an advisor assigned to them who's just on them, making sure they're engaged in school. So we're trying to be creative about finding solutions to that and happily stealing ideas from other states where it works. So I think we do focus a lot of that. And in terms of what we look like down the road, I think we have to find creative solutions. And using our existing facilities. And one of the things you'll hear a lot about if you're out and about in the state is UW-Platteville is offering engineering courses at UW-Fox Valley. So, and the weekends and evenings. UW Rock, you go in on a Saturday, you turn on their computer, and there you're in a lab at UW platform. We're doing all sorts of that kind of stuff, and that's one of those things I spoke to earlier, we don't talk enough about, because those are, I think, the kind of innovative solutions that allow us to leverage our resources efficiently and effectively considering the challenges.
I'll just add briefly that some of the demographic shifts and geographic context here that really matters is that most students, this is nationwide, most students stay 25 miles from home when they go to college. That should be surprising if we have this image of somebody flying across the country to go to USC. The number of people but that's, it's such a local decision that we need to really be thoughtful about the local infrastructure and the local needs. And so in the governor's budget, I was very pleased to see that there was this commitment to capacity building, which is a national trend. A lot of states are moving in this direction, saying, we want colleges to perform, but what if they don't have the capacity to do so? What if they don't have the resources right now to hit those performance goals that we think we need, or that to adopt practices we know are very promising that work? And so it's a chicken and an egg problem. Do you ask for performance first and then expect, or do you build capacity and then ask for performance? So I was very pleased to see that in this budget. I think that would have a very high return, and I think that helps campuses think even more strategically and prioritizing what they're up to. So that was good to see.
Great, thank you.
Can I make a comment on that?
No. Yeah, no, of course. You may.
No, and what I was going to say to Professor Hillman's point was that as the chairman of the colleges universities committee, I watch this stuff and I look at it very closely. Every legislator is not on my committee, and so there's a lot of them out there that aren't as closely attached to these issues as some others. When you talk about capacity building, it throws them for a loop. Because they're being told on a regular basis that we got less high school graduates, and then the university comes and says, we need to build capacity. And they're like, oh my God, what's going on here? This makes no sense. And so we need to somehow try to get that, this whole subject matter and this argument into something that people understand. And easily understand, because you have to understand there are other legislators that are in, they're working in transportation and they're in natural resources and they're in, whatever. And we try to make this something that's a little easier for them to grasp hold of.
Great, thank you. And thank you, before we go on, thank you for everyone for their candor. You're not just giving boilerplate responses. I really appreciate that. There's one thing I want to add, just as a quick side. When people talk about demographic changes in Wisconsin, the assumption is that the number of graduating high school students are decreasing. But when you look at the data from the Census Bureau and down here to Applied Population Lab, that's not so much the case. It ebbs and flows. So there's a narrative out there that talks about declining demographics in the sense of elementary, middle, and high schools. And it's like this. Now it's projected in 2022, 2023 to go down. And then my second editorial point is, we have a large percentage of graduated high school students who don't go on to post-secondary education, especially when you compare it to other states. Minnesota, our neighbor. So the question becomes, in other states look at this as it relates to more students going to Oshkosh or Parkside, etc., is we don't have enough students going on. Some of them get jobs, of course, but that's a big issue for Wisconsin, is we have a smaller percentage of graduated high school students, and they tend to be low income, they tend to be first generation, and right now, as I said earlier, the growing population of Latinx students is erupting. And Marquette, Alverno, UW-Milwaukee, they're all working to become a Hispanic serving institution, which is a federal designation. Why is that? It's because that's where the growing population is in southeast Wisconsin. And when I was talking to Chancellor Shields at Platteville, thank you, same thing. What's going on within southwest Wisconsin with the growing demographics? So Latinx students at the middle school and high school. So then it becomes, what do our admission staff look like? How do we recruit them? How do we offer this, inclusive counseling towards the state? That's excellent. Right? So, I'm sorry, little editorial comment. How should the state approach the issue of early career relevant education versus mid-career development or retraining? I think it gets at perhaps the age of the student as well as the type of degree programs that are offered, perhaps more of the arts and humanities, perhaps a little more towards the professional. Nick?
It made me think about your last point about the demographic changes, where we do see population growth, and this is from the American Community Survey that just came out a couple weeks ago with the newest data. For Wisconsin, the greatest growth is on our 25-plus population who have some college but no degree. In a college wants enrollment growth, that's your market, and that's across the state. You see that is where a lot of growth is happening. So that would be one, I think,
Great.
connection.
Excellent, thank you.
You were talking before, about the number of people in Wisconsin who have degrees. And so a couple of years ago, we sat working with a national organization, national foundation called the Lumina Foundation. We set an attainment goal. And I remember going to a Lumina seminar out in Denver, Colorado, talking about this. And it was a group of us from Wisconsin. And so we set a 60% attainment goal. That's that 60% of the people in Wisconsin would have a 4-year degree, 2-year degree, or a significant credential of some type. Some kind of like a journeyman's license or something in that regard. And at that time, we were at 47%. Well, before a lot of the states started pushing harder to raise their attainment goals, 47% was pretty good. We were not in too bad shape. But since that time, in the last few years, with more states setting these attainment goals, we were starting to fall behind. Since we set the attainment goal, our attainment rate has gone up to about 51%. So we're making some progress on that. And I see some good things happening. I think it's going to move right along. The question you had, though, was about younger students, older students. One of the discussions I had recently, and I was invited to a dinner with an organization called MEC. And MEC stands for the Midwest Higher Education Council. And that particular organization covers 12 states and works with universities throughout those states and provides services to them. The university could buy insurance from MEC, for instance. And so they try to find things that they can do for the universities, pool those resources in. But the discussion we had there on older education, I brought it up and I said, I run into lots of people out in the public that have a degree, or maybe don't have a degree, but have worked in a business for many years and are, experts in certain areas. And it was interesting, I brought this up. One of the guys at the table was Mark Tyler. Mark is on the board for the UW Technical Colleges. He's also on the UW Board of Regents. Mark is the owner of his own company, very successful. He does not have a bachelor's degree. He does have a master's degree, however, because he was able to go to a university, I believe in Minnesota, and they didn't care whether he had his bachelor's on, and was able to get a master's in finance in the business area. And this is something that's very interesting to me, and I've had a lot of discussions. My son-in-law, Brad Chandler, is the director of the Nicholas Center here at the UW Business School. And he very much is looking at that ability to reach out to people in business and to be able to give them that knowledge that they're looking for. They're not looking for degrees as much at that level sometimes. They want to know how to do their job better. So they work for a bank. They want some additional finance education. They're in business. They want some more marketing education. And they don't want to get hung up in a lot of the problems with whether they meet this prerequisite or that prerequisite. They want additional education in their field of expertise.
Thank you. Other comments?
Just one comment on that. Talking about the attainment goal for Lumina to create. I was at a conference last year on this, and they talked a lot about the only way a lot of states are coming to the realization the only way they'll get to that number is to get those underserved minorities brought up and to get those people to go back to school. So the states are being very intentional in how they're focusing resources on that, and I think that's something that I know we're looking at system-wide as well. And part of that strategy is to work more closely with businesses. We've got to steal that approach from the technical colleges who are so good at it. Is you've got employees who don't have a degree, we can create pathways to get them degrees that are nights, weekends, online combinations, and in many cases employers are willing to pay for it because, like you said earlier, the workplace is so competitive right now. There's opportunities like that, so we've got to do both of those things. I think because the attainment goal is really important. I think it's extremely important for the future of the state.
Can I play the obligatory cold water throwing role here for just a moment? But I would be constructive about it. So studies from a lot of other states, they're able to link their education data with their workforce data, and they can really see, they can measure out, hey, what's the return to different credentials in the labor force, 5, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. And pretty consistently, they're finding short-term credentials, short-term certificates aren't outperforming a high school diploma. And so I do worry when we have states adopting these completion goals, I do worry that they might be empty. They might have a new certificate or a credential, but it might not pay off in the labor market. I'm not saying that's the case in Wisconsin. There's certainly going to be variability around that, but this is my plea for some connection between our education data and our workforce data so we can test some of this stuff out.
And I will agree with you to a certain extent, but it's they may not be long-lasting, but they might do you a lot of good over that 5-year period. And then you may need to go and get another credential that sets you up. Because this is all about lifelong learning, very much, this whole subject.
So I would like to talk specifically about something I think as it relates to, I mentioned earlier, I really value retention over recruitment. I think recruitment's important, but a lot of people who have preconceived notions about the fact that they're already going to go to college, right? Like, they're there, we have it, we just got to get them to the institution that needs it. There's these other people who maybe don't think they can. And a lot of times the price tag is the #1 inhibitor. And Tennessee has done some great research on this when they mandated that every high school student, when they take their, whatever, the ACT or SAT, I can't remember whichever one they're taking junior year, they're also mandatory, it's mandated that they have to follow the FAFSA. That might sound counterintuitive, but when they find out they're eligible for Pell Grants, suddenly it clicks and they can go to the campus nearest them and maybe even walk, and they don't have to worry about other hurdles like transportation then, or the fact that they have to work full-time. So my fiance, his story, I think really captures where people should be looking. He went to UW Scout for 2 years. He was undeclared. He said, you know what, I don't know if this is worth it for me, so I'm just going to go back home to Stevens Point and work in the workforce. So we worked at Century Insurance, a great employer, for a while. We met, and I started putting the bug in his ear, like, hey, maybe you need a college degree at some point. And, you're going to make $1 million over time. What do you want to do? And he knew he always wanted to go back, but he wanted to explore. So I said, hey, why don't you try out the local technical college and take a couple accounting classes, because that's what he was interested in. He did, he loved it, he took the courses at night so he could work full time, and eventually when he transferred to UWSP for degrees in accounting and business, the biggest challenge that he had, and I hear this all the time from non-traditional students, is finding the classes around his work schedule. Because most people are not willing to give up that full-time work experience. You know, you're sacrificing promotions in the workplace in addition to the opportunity cost of how much you earn in the workplace when you're taking time off to go to school. And so we need to make our institutions of higher learning more inclusive and diverse. And we also have to help people who do want that credential, whether it's a post-bac, 2-year credential, or whether it's a bachelor's degree or master's, do it around work, because most people cannot afford to take off that time for 3, 4, 5, or 6 years. Because if you add up all the years my fiance spent at 3 different campuses, it's 6 years of time. 6 years. It took forever. And when he graduated, I threw myself a party because I was working full time to help him with all that, and he wasn't full time the whole time. But that's the point. And I hear this all the time when I talk to college students. What are your biggest barriers? What are you hearing from your friends who aren't in school, who want to? And most people, that affordability, that price tag is number one. But the support when you get to campus, the nighttime classes, the online and in-person classes mix. I think that's where we need to go, and I really like everything that Jeff has to say. I don't mean to diminish what UW System's already doing. But in many students' experience, it's the individual faculty who are supportive of them. We have faculty at UW Students Point who will say, your car broke down? Well, I guess I won't take off 10 points for you missing class today because you have a 45-minute drive, right? It's things like that. We need a more forgiving institution when it comes to being able to support the people who want to be there but also have other priorities in their lives. And that's what I'd like to see future conversations about higher education include is we do have people who fall below the median income of Wisconsin, who have significant barriers to attainment. How do we attack those barriers for attainment for them so they can focus on higher education?
Well, Katrina, wasn't Stevens Point the one that was going back and giving associate's degrees in their records? It seemed to me that UW Stevens Point actually went back and was looking at the records of past students. And if they had achieved the credits for an associate's degree, but had never been on that path, they're actually sending them a letter and say, hey, you got an associate's degree. And statistics are showing that an associate's degree is worth more than just 2 years of college. And the other thing that it was doing was when people got their associate degree, it sort of made them think a little bit about maybe I should get more. And I just thought that was a really neat idea, and I really supported that particular idea.
Yeah, that great credit goes to the UW system. They worked with the campuses and encouraged that. So again, Jeff and your colleagues do a great deal. Thanks for doing all that.
I'm going to jump in again, Jeff. Sorry. I think that just point about the FAFSA on the federal, the free application for federal student aid is oftentimes prohibitive for students to go to college and pay for college. We can have some technical fixes right now in our state with if our data infrastructure were sort of intact to be able to allow high school counselors, for example, to find out that, hey, John, you submitted your FAFSA, but you haven't completed it yet. And there's really good evidence that those nudges can really have benefits for students. So I think this conversation is making me think about and really get excited about where we can go and between the system and elected officials and the excellent researchers on campus. We've got some folks right here who would love to be able to engage in those conversations and help find some technical solutions to meet our human problems.
Great. Yeah, great comments, Nick. Thank you. One final question will come from me, sifting through some of these. I'm going to try to put it into one. And then, like I said, unfortunately or fortunately, some of us have to leave at 1:15, so we'll have to stop, but we'll stay after. Specific question, and it's tied to what we just discussed. So we have the UW College, former UW colleges are now branch campuses. So UW Platteville, now they have UW Platteville at Baraboo, UW Platteville at Richland, at UW Stevens Point, we have UW Stevens Point at Marshall, we have UW Stevens Point at Wausau, not Marion County anymore, which is in Marion County. So my question to the four of you is, what advice do you have for both the chancellors of those mother or father institutions with the faculty and the deans and directors of those now new branch campuses? Let me give you, for example, there's discussions of whether or not they should offer baccalaureate degrees specific to the region. Perhaps they should do financial, four-year degrees in financial as it relates to Wausau because they have a lot of insurance companies like Stevens Point, etc. Or food science in the Baraboo area. There's lots of food science programs, produce, etc. Same thing in other campuses. So I'm just curious, what advice would you have as it relates to changing demographics, the role and purpose of higher education, and the opportunity, unique opportunity for physical campuses to provide, either continue doing what they're doing or doing something different completely? What advice do you have?
Utilize shared governance first and foremost. Always take advice, insights, and perspective from the people on the ground. But also I would say hold focus groups with members of the community. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's incredibly important to recognize the value of individual perspectives of members of the community and not just the businesses there, but everybody else. I'll give you an example when it comes to workforce. So for a long time we've been talking about workforce development as training individuals specifically for one job at one manufacturing facility or insurance company that needs IT workers, and we've taken for granted the idea that if we train them, they will come, and more people will come because they'll find about this training. And there needs to be an organic interest as well, and that's something that is forgotten. So a couple of years ago, our local technical college put together like a rapid response training for IT workers because I hear from our 3 major employers who say they could hire 100 people on the spot. Well, guess what? 2 people showed up. 2. So we're all thinking, oh, hey, let's do this great IT training, and 2 people show up. And so it isn't just, oh, hey, like we need people with the training. We also need people who want to be in those fields, and we need to be having those conversations in the schools first, and with parents and community members who need to be thinking about that. So I do think when it comes to just designating, well, you know, there's lots of insurance in Wausau and there's lots of paper in Stevens Point, that's great, but show me the data first, because if we're going to expand the paper science program, which we are, and which is fantastic, let's talk to the students and make sure they want that, and let's talk to the people who will come there instead of just the paper folks who want it. And in this case, that's a great example of something that works, that students love. There's 100% job placement, usually by the time they're a junior in college, which is fantastic. But there's the converse of that too, which is everyone wants to be in IT, therefore let's build an IT class, and then get shocked when no one shows up. And I'm not criticizing anyone. I was part of that too, thinking it was a great thing. But we need to understand where people are looking, why they're leaving. If they choose to stay, why are they staying? Is it their pay, their benefits? Are they paying off student loan debt because the cost is cheaper to live there, et cetera, et cetera? All of those conversations need to be had in these communities where we're designating where these degrees are, like Wausau and Marshfield and Stevens Point. We can't just designate willy-nilly, here you go, XYZ, done, by talking to 5 employers and calling it a day. And so my best advice is please do not make assumptions. Please use facts, data, and evidence-based perspectives if at all possible and when possible. And when not, also utilize folks on the ground who maybe aren't in higher education, but who can provide valid viewpoints, like students in high schools, parents. Don't forget guidance counselors in high schools. I think attitudes toward higher education is important to gauge as well. I'm looking at where people are going. The last thing I want to see happen is institutions of higher education polling 5 employers in one county, saying, what do you guys want? Putting it together, slapping together a degree program and calling it a day, because I can guarantee you it's not going to be successful without talking to the folks locally who are the most likely to attend, right? So that's just my perspective. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this, but I think we do need to listen to other people and not just rely on a couple people making these huge decisions that will impact the economy locally for at least a decade, if not more.
Thank you. Representative Murphy, I know you have another commitment, so do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I'll be real quick. So the whole merger of these 2-year campuses into the 4-year campuses Is it good or bad? I think it's more good than it is bad, but like anything else, it's not perfect. You know, there are issues from time to time, and I think when you look at the different groupings, some are going to work out better than others. I happen to be in an area where UW-Oshkosh has taken on UW-Fox Valley and UW-Fond du Lac. That has worked pretty well. And UW-Fox Valley had a partnership with Platteville for training engineers. A couple months back, we had a meeting, and Chancellor Shields, Chancellor Lovett came to UW-Fox and signed an agreement to keep that going and actually to expand that. So that is a way in which we can partner together and really have some positive results. The more that we can do that within these groupings of universities, the better off we're going to be. I think I went to UW-Fox Valley myself. At that time, you had to go somewhere else for a 4-year degree. Now you're part of Oshkosh and your 4-year degree can come there. I think more people see that as a benefit than any distraction that may come from those campuses being together. So,
Thank you. Well, you have to leave, Representative Murphy.
yes, and I would love to be able to talk to everybody here afterwards. Please come and see me if you'd like to talk. I would love to talk to anybody here that would like to do that. I'm in 318 North. I'm a mile away. Come on over.
I've got to run also, I have a 1:30.
Okay, so let's say thank you. I'm going to hold Jeff and Nick here for so, but let's first say thank you to the two legislators.